A white bank manager looked at a six-figure check, then looked at the name on it. Big Shaq's daughter. Instead of verifying, assumptions were made. Security was called. What the manager didn't know: the woman holding that check doesn't just cash money, she owns the bank it came from. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. Morning spilled golden light over the heart of the financial district, washing the mirrored towers in warmth and promise. Dominion First Bank stood at the center of it all, like a monument, glass and stone, authority carved in symmetry and shine. Its lobby buzzed softly with murmured phone calls and clipped footsteps, tailored suits brushing past one another like pieces on a board few understood. The air smelled of quiet power, designer perfume, fresh polish, and old money expectations. Everything in this place had been curated to impress, except for who walked in next. Mira O'Neill stepped through the revolving door, without hesitation. The world outside may have softened its edges under the sun, but she remained carved from intent. Her presence moved like a statement, subtle yet commanding. A dark tailored suit hugged her tall frame, her low bun precise, her stride unbothered. She held no phone, wore no distraction, just a slim black bag in one hand, and clarity in her eyes. From the instant she crossed the threshold, the atmosphere shifted, but in a way few would admit. At first, nothing outward changed. The receptionist glanced up and greeted her with a practiced smile, though it faded just slightly when their eyes met. Two private wealth advisors paused their conversation mid-sentence. A security guard near the far corner adjusted his stance. These were micro-movements, almost imperceptible, yet familiar to Mara. She had seen this choreography before. It was the kind that unfolded not with alarm but assumption. She approached the front counter and placed a folded check and her identification on the marble surface. The teller, a boy, really, who couldn't have been far from his first job, smiled nervously. His fingers trembled slightly as he reached for the papers, scanning them with furrowed brows. Then came the predictable line. "Excuse me, I'll need to check with my manager." Mira nodded once, and stepped aside, her posture still and unreadable. Around her, the conversations resumed, but quieter now. People looked without appearing to. Mira didn't respond. She had no desire to play defense in a space she already owned. From behind the frosted glass office came Thomas Ellison, impeccably groomed and exuding forced confidence. Thomas moved like someone who had memorized the optics of leadership, but never questioned the foundation beneath it. His navy suit gleamed, his cufflinks caught the light. He extended a hand that Mira didn't take, and so he turned it into a gesture toward the check instead. "Ms. O'Neill, good morning," he said with a measured tone. "I understand you're attempting to cash this." "I'm not attempting," she replied. "I am cashing it." Thomas chuckled lightly, though the sound held no amusement. "Of course. I just meant, well, it's quite a large amount. Naturally, we have to follow protocol." Mira met his gaze without blinking. "Which protocol is that?" He ignored the question, flipping the check over in his hand. His fingers hovered near the signature, hesitating. "We have to verify the source. You understand, large checks raise red flags, even for regular clients." "I'm not a client." "I see. Then may I ask how you came into possession of this check?" "It was issued to me," she said simply. "As payment." "Payment for?" She let the silence settle between them until it became uncomfortable. Then she said, "You don't need to know that." His jaw tightened. "It's standard due diligence." "No, it's selective curiosity." The room seemed to shrink then, not in size but in atmosphere, the kind of stillness that precedes consequence. Thomas glanced around, looking for backup in the eyes of his staff, but none of them met his gaze. He coughed softly and gestured toward the velvet-cushioned seating area. "If you wouldn't mind waiting, I'll get this sorted out." Mira's lips twitched, something between a smirk and a warning, but she turned without another word and moved toward the lounge. As she passed the executive doors, her eyes flicked briefly to the etched glass panel bearing her last name, O'Neill. Still, she said nothing. The minutes dragged, 10, then 15. Customers arrived and were assisted. An older white man cashed a check 4 times the size of hers and received a fresh bottle of water and a friendly handshake. A young blonde woman came in asking about wire transfers and was ushered to a private office. Mira, meanwhile, was still waiting, No one offered her so much as a cup of coffee. By the 23rd minute, Thomas returned. This time he wasn't alone. A second man accompanied him. Short, balding, with a leather portfolio clutched like a shield. His smile was apologetic before he even spoke. "Ms. O'Neill," he began, "there's been some confusion." She stood slowly. "No. There's been a presumption." Thomas shifted uncomfortably. The second man continued. "We weren't aware of your role. If we'd known, we would have expedited. But you didn't care to ask," Mira interrupted, her tone cool but sharpened at the edges. "You looked at me and made a decision, and you were wrong." Thomas finally noticed the name etched into the glass just feet away from him. A flush crept into his neck. "You assumed," she said, cutting him off again. "Like many do. You believed the space was yours to define, and I was an outlier to be questioned. But you work for me. This bank bears my name, and every minute you spent delaying was a minute spent revealing exactly what this institution protects, and what it resists." There was nothing left to say. She walked past them, without needing to raise her voice, or declare her authority. The silence she left behind was heavier than any argument could have been. Her heels echoed with finality, as she moved toward her office door, pushed it open, and entered without looking back. Behind her, Thomas stood rooted to the floor. The balding man mumbled something about a miscommunication, but no one listened. The lobby had gone still. Inside her office, Mira settled behind her desk. She opened her laptop with one smooth motion, and began typing. A moment later, her assistant's voice came through the intercom. "Your 10 a.m. has been moved to 10:30. The audit team is ready whenever you are. Start with customer-facing protocols." Mira replied, "Flag anything with discretionary enforcement." "Yes, Chairwoman." She ended the call and leaned back in her chair. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to close her eyes, not in weariness, but in grounding. She had known what this day would cost, emotionally, but she hadn't flinched, because this wasn't just about one bank, one check, or one man. It was about the quiet systems that still filtered presence through prejudice, and she was done waiting politely, at the counter. Outside the glass walls, the day continued. Customers came and went. The sun shifted, but the foundation had cracked, if only slightly. A story had begun that wouldn't stay contained within the lobby. And Mira O'Neill wasn't just here to collect what she was owed. She was here to change the way the room decided who was owed anything at all. Thomas Ellison stared at the check, as though it might vanish under the weight of his discomfort. The numbers printed on it glared back. 6 digits, legally sound, crisp and clean. Everything about it screamed legitimacy, yet everything in him recoiled, not because of the check, because of the hand that carried it. He stood a little too stiff, his voice rehearsed but shallow. "As I mentioned, Ms. O'Neill, the amount here requires verification." He looked around as if summoning invisible policy from thin air. "Just a formality, I assure you." Mira didn't move. She didn't blink. Her silence pressed down harder than raised voices ever could. The temperature in the room dropped by degrees, not literally but atmospherically. The surrounding tellers kept their heads low, typing just a little too deliberately. The security guard at the far wall shifted again, now with both hands clasped in front of him, stance square, eyes forward. Mira slowly straightened. "You've already verified the routing number, the issuing account, and my ID. What you want now is reassurance, not security." Thomas exhaled, almost a chuckle. "We just have to be careful. I hope you understand. If I let this through without triple-checking and something goes wrong." "Nothing's going wrong," she cut in, soft but firm. "Accept your judgment." "I don't appreciate the tone." "You're not required to. You're required to honor the transaction." The stare between them was cold and unflinching. Thomas didn't win it. Instead, he stepped back and turned to the teller, waving a dismissive hand. "Call the internal compliance desk," he said. "Tell them we have a flagged transaction, and a potentially uncooperative client." Mira handheld, then looked down at the check, still sitting between them like a silent witness. Her fingers remained at her side, unmoved. "You are going to escalate this," she said slowly, "because your discomfort outweighs your professionalism." "I'm doing my job." "No, you're failing at it." He said nothing. Instead, he made a signal, discreet but clear. The kind that invited escalation dressed as protocol. The kind that told security to step in before anything actually happened. The moment the security guard began walking toward them, the room shifted once more. It wasn't the movement that signaled danger. It was the timing. Calculated. Expected. Not for disruption, but performance. Miara's posture didn't change, but her voice cooled. If your policy includes intimidation, I suggest you revise it. Immediately. The guard stopped a foot away, uncertain now. His eyes darted between her and Thomas. He was waiting for something, an outburst, a refusal, anything to justify the next step. But Mira gave him nothing. Thomas, however, had found just enough ground to pretend composure. We're not intimidating anyone. We're exercising caution. No, she replied evenly. You're exercising bias. At that moment, a chime interrupted the tension. A gentle tone from the elevator at the far end of the lobby. The doors opened to reveal a pair of sharply dressed executives. Mid-conversation, emerging with the kind of confidence reserved for those who make decisions rather than follow them. And behind them, walking like he owned the floor beneath his feet, came Big Shaquille O'Neal. He wore no suit, just a tailored navy bomber and slacks, but there was nothing casual about him. His presence silenced conversations in a way that had nothing to do with celebrity and everything to do with presence. Tall, grounded, commanding without a single word. He had just come from a closed-door meeting on the 42nd floor. A quarterly board review no one in that lobby knew was happening, except Momora. As soon as he saw her, his brow lifted slightly, not in surprise but recognition. He didn't rush. He didn't ask questions. He simply walked forward, and every eye in the room recalibrated. Thomas blinked. His breath caught. He turned instinctively toward the security guard, now completely frozen. The shift in power was visible, unspoken, but absolute. Big Shaq reached Mira and placed a hand gently on her shoulder. You good, baby? She looked at him calmly, then nodded once. He called security, said the check needed further verification. Big Shaq glanced down at the check, then looked up at Thomas. That's so. Thomas straightened, sweating now in places he hoped were hidden. I was following protocol, sir. I didn't realize. Didn't realize what? Shaq asked. His voice was still calm, too calm. Didn't realize who she was, or didn't realize who you were talking to. The lobby, once bustling, was now silent, except for the low hum of background music. No one could hear anymore. Thomas stammered, his eyes darting toward the other executives, hoping for backup. They remained silent, watching, evaluating. She didn't identify herself, he offered weakly. She didn't say. She didn't need to. Shaq interrupted. Her name's on the board, her signature's on the internal reports. This bank? She's on its deeds. The fact that you looked at her and thought she was anything less than your superior tells me exactly what I need to know. Mayora didn't look at Thomas. Her attention was on the ripple in the air, the shift that came when power misjudged its direction. This wasn't about a check. It had never been. The check was bait. The real balance being tested wasn't in a bank account. Shaq turned to the security guard. You can step back. There's no threat here. The guard nodded, retreating 2 steps as if trying to blend into the wallpaper. Thomas swallowed. Mr. O'Neal, please understand. I understand just fine, Shaq replied, then turned to Mira. You want to handle this your way, or should I? I already am, she said. And with that she picked up the check, held it steady between her fingers, and turned to the teller, who looked like he wanted to vanish. She handed it to him. Process it. Now. The teller nodded frantically and moved, typing, clicking, obeying the speed of authority finally recognized. Mira glanced at Thomas one last time, her voice low but cutting. You mistook the silence for weakness. You mistook the calm for compliance. But you didn't see the structure. That's your real error. Thomas said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Shaq slipped his arm around his daughter's shoulder as they walked toward the glass doors. But before they reached them, she paused. This bank will issue a statement. Public. Acknowledging bias and reform. A full compliance review will follow. And you, she looked back at Thomas, will not be here when it's done. Then she stepped into the sunlit plaza, leaving behind a room that had misread not just a check, but an entire legacy. This wasn't about money. This was about who got to define power, and who was about to redefine it. As the teller processed the transaction under pressure and the weight of consequence, Thomas Ellison made a desperate pivot. His voice regained some of its false composure, and he gestured toward the hallway behind the lobby. Miss O'Neal, if you wouldn't mind, we'd appreciate it if you stepped into our compliance office. Standard protocol. Just to finalize some things. Mira paused, glanced at the teller's trembling hands, then turned her gaze on Thomas. Her expression didn't shift. She allowed the silence to stretch, not in resistance, but calculation. She knew what this was. She'd seen it before. Not the escalation, but the reframing. The soft redirection from public embarrassment to private control. A quiet room where they could speak in codes and limits. Shielded from witnesses. She nodded once. Lead the way. Thomas, clearly hoping the move would reset the power dynamic, led her toward the frosted glass door labeled Internal Compliance Suite. The hallway dimmed from the gleam of the open floor to a cooler, quieter tone. Sterile carpet, indirect lighting, doors that muffled conversation. A woman in a gray pencil skirt and headset buzzed them in with a half-hearted glance. No warmth, no recognition. Inside, the room was designed to feel comfortable, but remained anything but. 2 chairs too stiff, a round table too empty, a fake fern in the corner, too artificial. A wall-mounted screen blinked with an inactive login prompt. 2 more bank employees entered behind her. Middle-aged, pressed collars, notepad in hand, expressions too careful. Mirara took her seat without being asked. She placed her bag beside her and folded her hands in her lap. She didn't fidget. She didn't inquire. She waited. One of the employees, a thin man with salt and pepper hair, opened a tablet. We just have a few things we need to confirm, Ms. O'Neill. Nothing formal. It's our obligation to ensure high-value transactions follow due diligence. Of course, she said evenly. His tone was tight with performative politeness. This check was made out to you, but the issuing account hasn't processed an amount this high through this branch before. Naturally, we have to ensure there are no flags for laundering or third-party fraud. She tilted her head slightly. Is the account legitimate? Yes.
Is the signature verified?
Yes. Is the ID valid? Yes. She raised an eyebrow. Then what's left to verify? There was a brief hesitation, just enough to let the room fill with the subtext it was built to hide. The second employee, a younger woman in a navy shift dress, cleared her throat. We just want to understand the nature of the payment. The relationship between you and the sender. Mira leaned back, gaze narrowing. You want to understand the relationship because the number on the check doesn't align with the story in your head about someone who looks like me. Neither employee responded. They looked at their tablets instead. The woman spoke again. Our questions aren't personal. They're procedural. That's the problem, Miara said quietly. You've convinced yourselves they're neutral when they're anything but. The air in the room flattened. The carefully curated smiles faded. Now the treatment shifted, sharpened not by words but tone. Every sentence clipped shorter, every glance edged with skepticism. Do you have documentation supporting the origin of these funds? I do. Will you provide it? I'll provide what's legally required. A beat passed. Then the man leaned in slightly. We're not here to cause friction. Cooperation will move this faster. I'm not interested in speed, Miara said. I'm interested in accountability. He tried to smile but failed. The younger woman scribbled a note she didn't need to take. A red light blinked faintly from the corner of the ceiling. Recorded, likely, for their protection. Mimera pulled out her phone, not in defiance, but with deliberate calm. She scrolled, tapped a contact and placed the phone to her ear. It rang once. Upstairs in the boardroom on the 42nd floor, Shaquille O'Neal's phone vibrated on the table. He picked it up mid-discussion, lifting a hand to pause the flow of presentation slides and forecast charts. Hey, he said low and calm. On the other end, Mayera's voice matched his. Measured, composed, unmistakably serious. I think we've got a situation downstairs. That was all she said. That was all she needed to say. Shaq gave no reaction at first. No widened eyes, no barked orders. He simply nodded once and said, I'll be right there. He turned to the table of men in suits, each one quiet now beneath the weight of whatever he didn't say out loud. We'll finish this later. And with that he stood, adjusted his jacket, and walked out. Back in the compliance room, Mamera ended the call and placed her phone face down on the table. The staff watched her closely now, but it wasn't about curiosity anymore. It was about control. She had disrupted the unspoken hierarchy. She wasn't behaving like someone being scrutinized. She was evaluating them. More questions followed, about her employment, her affiliations, even inquiries about her tax records, masked as financial tracing. She answered the necessary ones. declined the rest. The room's civility thinned with every calm refusal. "Why don't we take a break?" the woman suggested, voice stretched with feigned grace. "Give us time to pull a few things on our end." Mimara nodded, stood, and walked toward the window at the far end of the office. Through the tinted glass, the city shimmered. Movement and money, power and posture, all unfolding 20 stories below. A moment later, the compliance door opened without a knock. Shaquille O'Neal stepped inside. There was no need for introduction. Everyone in that room had seen him, on screens, in interviews, on the boardroom monitors announcing quarterly updates. But nothing on those screens had prepared them for this version. Not the gentle giant in commercials. Not the celebrity with a smile. This version moved with intent, not anger. Purpose. He looked at his daughter first. She gave a slight nod. He understood everything. Then he turned to the staff. "We have a problem." The man in the chair rose halfway. "Mr. O'Neal, sir, this is all part of our internal risk framework. We were just clarifying a few." "No, you weren't," Shaq said. "You were trying to discredit her. Quietly, behind closed doors, hoping the right tone would trigger compliance. But you're going to learn today that not all protocols protect institutions. Some expose them." The room went quiet. He stepped forward, his tone still calm. "She told you who she was without raising her voice, without leveraging her title. She gave you the opportunity to do what was right, and you chose performance over integrity." The staff said nothing. No more note-taking. No more rehearsed explanations. The charade was over. Shaq turned to Miura. "You ready to go?" She nodded. As they exited, no one moved. No protests. No excuses. Just silence. The kind that follows a reckoning, not a confrontation. By the time the door closed behind them, the lesson had already begun echoing across departments. Not through shouting, through presence. Because Miura hadn't walked into that room asking for validation. She walked in owning it, and the institution that thought it could diminish her was now the one under scrutiny. The elevator descended with a hushed grace, floor numbers flicking by with the slow precision of inevitability. Shaquille O'Neal stood in the center, unmoving, his massive frame stoic, his eyes fixed on the doors. The suit he wore wasn't designer. It didn't need to be. The weight of his presence wasn't draped in labels. It was forged in legacy. When the doors slid open on the teller floor, he stepped out with no fanfare. No one looked up right away. Not because they weren't watching, but because they didn't expect him. The Dominion First Bank lobby had returned to its carefully curated rhythm. Conversations about mortgage approvals, pension portfolios, and structured notes murmured beneath the click of polished shoes. But within seconds, that rhythm cracked, like a low vibration before an earthquake. An instinctual shift rippled across the floor. Shaq walked across the marble, with a patience that felt deliberate. Eyes began to track his movement, some uncertain, some alert. The reception desk fell silent. A junior associate blinked twice, almost unsure if he was seeing correctly. Two tellers leaned out from behind their screens, but no one approached. No one dared. Not until Thomas Ellison emerged from a side hallway, still holding the memory of the compliance office like a stain on his collar. His steps slowed the moment he saw Shaq. His face stiffened. He took a breath, painted on a professional expression, and "Mr. O'Neal," he began, voice rehearsed. "If I could explain the context of what just happened." Shaq said nothing. Thomas faltered, but pressed on. "There was a misunderstanding. We were following internal compliance procedure. We had no idea she was." Shaq raised a hand, slow, steady, palm open. Thomas stopped mid-sentence, lips still parted. The room quieted completely. Conversations ended in unfinished words. Even the security guard near the main door stood still, arms rigid by his sides. Shaq turned slightly, just enough to let his voice carry. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. "You denied the financial rights of the woman who signs your payroll." The silence that followed devoured everything. It wasn't dramatic. It was surgical. Final. The kind of silence that rewrote the rules of the room. Thomas stood frozen, his face twitching at the corners. The weight of that single sentence landed everywhere, on the shoulders of the interns, pretending to check emails, on the assistant branch managers watching from the mezzanine glass, on the clients whose eyes darted between curiosity and discomfort. Shaq stepped forward once. "You didn't just question her identity. You questioned her place here. That's not policy. That's pathology." Thomas swallowed. Mr. O'Neill, if I had known. No, Shaq cut in, calm as ever. You didn't care to know. That's the issue. A ripple of murmurs stirred behind the counters. But no one dared speak. The usual safeguards title, tone, suit, offered Thomas no shield now. The power he had performed had been stripped bare. Shaq turned slowly, scanning the lobby. His eyes paused briefly on each employee, not in menace, but meaning. She didn't come in demanding special treatment. She didn't lead with her last name. She followed every procedure. And you decided she wasn't enough. He turned back to Thomas. But here's what you need to understand. Now, his voice dropped, just enough to make people lean in, but not soft enough to dilute the edge. She's more than enough. She's the future of this institution. And if her presence makes this place uncomfortable, then this place is what needs to change. Thomas opened his mouth again, but found no words. Shaq gestured toward the large glass office across the lobby, the one with Mira's name etched in silver. That office isn't just symbolic. She earned it. She owns it. And if there's any confusion about who belongs here, I suggest you start by asking whose signature keeps the lights on. Silence again. But this time, it wasn't just quiet. It was awareness, recognition, reckoning. Thomas's face drained of color. He took a step back, nodding almost imperceptibly. Understood, sir. Shaq didn't nod back. He didn't acknowledge the apology that had never been spoken. He simply walked toward Mira's office, pausing just before he reached the door. Then, over his shoulder, he added, "You won't be leading this branch by end of quarter." The words weren't a threat. They were a forecast. He opened the door and disappeared inside. Behind him, the floor remained still, chatter gone, motion suspended. Thomas stood alone, surrounded by the fragments of his authority. His reputation, once performed through posture and protocol, was cracked. Not by volume, not by scandal, but by truth spoken plainly, and without apology. In the corner, the security guard lowered his eyes. The receptionist began typing again. Slower this time. Several clients rose to leave, glancing nervously toward the door. No one would forget this moment. And from the office, just visible through the frosted glass, Mara and her father stood side by side. No dramatic embrace, no whispered strategy, just present, balanced, unmoved. What had just happened wasn't about punishment. It was about revelation. And now, the truth was just getting started. The bank boardroom on the 42nd floor had been quiet moments earlier. A modest mid-morning lull filled the space after Shaquille O'Neal's abrupt departure. The men around the glass conference table had continued their discussion with half-hearted interest, pretending the shift in tone didn't unsettle them. But by the time word reached them through executive messaging threads and departmental group chats, the calm was gone. What began as whispers escalated into urgent coded phrases. Compliance incident on the ground floor. Client escalation. Name tied to a stakeholder. Mira O'Neill. Possible PR issue. Some executives exchanged glances. A few recognized the last name instantly. Fewer knew the woman who bore it. By the time a senior VP burst through the boardroom doors, breath shallow and posture tense, there was no use in pretending ignorance. He stepped past the frosted partition and addressed the table directly. "We have a situation involving Miss Mara O'Neill. On the lobby floor, with staff intervention." One of the younger directors frowned. "Is she one of our clients?" The question drew a look from a senior member, whose brow pinched not with confusion but discomfort. "She's not a client, she's a co-owner." A beat passed. Then another. "Excuse me?" someone said. "Majority co-owner," the older executive clarified. Voice lower now. "Inherited through restructuring. Holds both equity and audit oversight. She's been leading our racial equity compliance strategy for 2 quarters. But she's never, I've never seen her at..." "That's the point," the older man interrupted. "You didn't see her." Now the energy in the room shifted. Laptops were closed. Coffee cooled, untouched. The air grew heavier as realization crystallized in the room. "She was on the lobby floor?" another executive asked. "Under what circumstances?" The VP hesitated. "An incident involving a teller, the branch manager, and a 6-figure check. She was taken to the compliance office." "She was what?" The director's voice cut the room like glass. "Apparently the check wasn't the issue," the VP added. "Or at least, not the real one." Downstairs, Myra sat alone in her office. Her posture unbothered, her silence deliberate. She'd returned from the compliance suite, with Shaq, neither of them needing to speak much. He had left her with a nod. Just enough solidarity. Just enough silence. Now she sat with the check beside her laptop. Uncashed. Untouched. She hadn't come for the check. Not really. She opened her email and typed a short note. Internal. Confidential. Tagged to audit. Compliance. HR. And public affairs. Subject line equity review trigger. Dominion First. Downtown branch. She attached 2 voice transcripts. One from the compliance room. One from the teller interaction. Then she clicked send. By the time she closed her laptop, the knock came. It wasn't timid. It wasn't apologetic. It was procedural. 3 soft knocks. The kind that suggested hierarchy without offering respect. She opened the door to find 3 executives standing in a line that looked rehearsed. The VP from earlier, the legal compliance officer, and the director of internal culture, none of whom had met her gaze in a boardroom before, though 2 of them had shared calls with her voice. Ms. O'Neill, the VP began, smoothing his tie. We'd like to speak with you, if this is a good time. It is, she said simply, gesturing for them to enter. The office wasn't grand, not by downtown standards. It was minimal, with soft wood and clean lines. A glass paperweight rested atop the only visible file, a black and white photograph of her and Shaq at the groundbreaking of a youth financial literacy center, sat quietly in the corner. The executives took their seats, though none seemed settled. The culture director began first, her voice polite but strained. We want to express, first, how deeply regretful we are that your experience at this branch didn't reflect our values. Mara looked at her calmly. You don't regret my experience. You regret the exposure. The woman hesitated, then smiled tightly. Perception matters. We're committed to addressing what happened today. What happened today, Miara said, didn't start today. The VP leaned forward slightly, hands clasped together. I think we're all interested in resolution, in learning how we can do better. That depends, Mara said, on whether you're willing to learn from the truth, or just polish the narrative. A pause. Then she reached into her drawer and pulled out a manila folder. She placed it on the table and slid it toward them. Inside, printouts of internal audit results, microaggression complaints logged by anonymous tellers, equity flag reports submitted and closed without follow-up. I've been reviewing this branch for 2 months, she said. Discreetly, strategically, not just for isolated bias but for patterns. The executives remained frozen, their bodies still, their faces slowly absorbing the meaning. The check, she continued, was a test. To observe how frontline staff interpret policy through personal bias. To see who got the benefit of the doubt and who got detention. The legal officer cleared his throat. You came here undercover? No, Mara said. I came here in plain sight. You just didn't recognize what you were looking at. Her voice didn't waver. It didn't rise. It simply existed, with the gravity of unassailable truth. I wasn't here to cash a check, she continued. I was here to cash in on transparency, and I'm afraid your branch is overdrawn. The VP opened the folder. His face tightened with every page. Data, annotations, notes from interviews, pattern recognition logs. He stopped halfway through, then looked up. You never intended to escalate, he said slowly. No, she replied. I intended to observe, but the escalation came from your staff. My role was just to document it. The silence stretched longer this time. Shame wasn't spoken aloud, but it pooled in the corners of the room. The culture officer looked down. The legal advisor remained unreadable. The VP leaned back in his chair and exhaled. What do you want us to do? He asked. Finally, Mara folded her hands. I want 3 things. They listened. 1. Immediate retraining of every compliance officer and teller on discretionary bias. They nodded. 2. A public-facing transparency report issued by this branch, acknowledging missteps not in vague corporate lingo but in real human terms. More nods. And 3, she said, voice firm now, an apology. Not just to me, to the people who came through this branch before me and didn't have the privilege of calling their father. The room was still. She let them sit with the discomfort. No handouts. No soft exits. Just the truth. Standing upright. After a long pause, the VP leaned forward again. We'll need your help. You already had it, Mara said. You just didn't recognize it. And for the first time since they entered the office, none of them had anything left to say. Not because they disagreed, but because she had just rewritten the moment. Not as a complaint, but as a mandate, not as reaction. But as leadership, the twist was no longer hers to reveal. It was now theirs to reckon with. The next morning, the sun hit Dominion First Bank's glass facade. Like any other day, clean, quiet, predictable. But inside, something fundamental had shifted. Beneath the polished calm, every office buzzed with a restrained urgency. Emails flew faster, conversations grew shorter, eyes flicked toward closed doors with cautious curiosity. The story of what had happened yesterday, of Mara O'Neill's check, the confrontation, the fallout, was no longer rumor. It was data. It was documentation. And now it was purpose. Miara entered the boardroom with no entourage, no announcement. She didn't need one. A thick file was tucked under her arm, marked only by a red tab at the corner. The moment she stepped in, the room settled. She wasn't a visitor anymore. She wasn't even just a stakeholder. She was the agenda. The chair of the board, a stiff man with silvered hair and the practiced neutrality of a career in finance, cleared his throat. Ms. O'Neill, I understand you've requested today's floor. I have, she said, placing the folder on the table. The boardroom, sleek and sterile, was made for presentations and projections. But today there would be no slideshow, no charts, just names, numbers, and the consequences they carried. She opened the file and began. I'm requesting a full demographic audit of account denial patterns over the past 5 years. I want a breakdown: race, age, income brackets, reasons given, all of it. The chair blinked. To clarify, are you asking I'm not asking, she interrupted. I'm directing. I have the authority to call for an internal equity audit, and I'm expanding the scope. A pause followed. One of the younger board members leaned forward. That's going to expose a lot. That's the point. Miara replied. We've been building our reputation on diversity statements while denying dignity at the teller line. I'm done patching symptoms. I want to address the system. There was a murmur of reaction, some intrigued, some cautious. The legal counsel shifted slightly in her seat. You understand this will require full access to client interaction logs, security reports, case resolution. I've already arranged legal oversight, Miara said. We'll anonymize where necessary, but we won't sanitize. Not this time. From the far end of the table, another director asked, what's the goal of this exactly? Miara met his eyes directly. I want policy change. Not for me, for every black client who's ever walked into this institution and felt the weight of unspoken suspicion. For every application denied because their tone was too assertive. For every security call that was just a precaution. We've written rules to protect our assets. Now I want rules that reflect our values. The room fell quiet again. Then the door opened. Shaquille O'Neal entered. No smile, no nod. He wore a crisp dark blazer and a stillness that felt heavier than his frame. He didn't sit at the head of the table. He took the chair beside Mora, the message loud in its simplicity. I back this, he said. The chair cleared his throat again. Mr. O'Neill. Shaquille, are you speaking in your capacity as a board partner or? I'm speaking as both, Shaq said. As a father. As a black man who's been turned away from conference rooms he could have bought. And as a stakeholder tired of performative change. There was no counter to that. Not in this room. Miara turned a page. Phase 1 starts with discovery. Phase 2 is implementation. I'll be proposing new bias training tied to promotion eligibility. I want new metrics tied to customer feedback audits, and a restructured grievance process for staff and clients alike. The culture officer, now visibly unsettled, asked cautiously, are we prepared for the media response? We're talking about admitting internal bias. That's going to raise questions. Good, Mara said. Let them come. And as if on cue, phones vibrated down the table. Notifications lit up. One of the board members glanced at his screen and paled slightly. It's already leaked, he muttered. The chair stiffened. What leaked? A memo. From compliance. Details of the lobby incident. And the name. Which name? Hers. There was a tense pause. The PR officer quickly began typing. I can prepare a holding statement. Emphasize that we're investigating. No. Shaq said, voice firm. We don't investigate what we already know. We lead. You release a statement, but not one that dodges, one that owns. She's not the problem. She's the answer. Miara closed the file. Let the public see what accountability looks like. Let them see us transforming, not covering. The chair ran a hand across his jaw. If we do this, we'll take hits. Investors may question stability. They'll respect transparency, Mira countered. And the ones who don't, we never needed them. Silence stretched. But this one was different. Not fear, not resistance. Contemplation. The kind that comes before inevitability. Finally, the chair nodded slowly. We'll begin phase 1 immediately. But you'll lead it. I intend to, Mira said, rising from her seat. The room remained seated as she left. Shaq walking quietly beside her. No applause, no formal titles, just movement. Change. Momentum. Downstairs, the lobby buzzed with its usual rhythm. Clients came and went. Security scanned badges, and tellers handled transactions like clockwork. But behind the glass, behind the desks, the staff already knew. Something had changed. She wasn't just another executive anymore. She was the new benchmark. And the bank had two choices: protect the image, or embrace the transformation she demanded. There was no middle ground now. Only truth, and what came next. The video leaked at 6:43 a.m., a grainy clip first posted by an anonymous user, just 45 seconds long, pulled from Dominion First Bank's internal security feed. Within an hour it had been downloaded, reshared and overlaid with captions, commentary and threads of outrage. What the footage lacked in clarity, it more than delivered in tension. In the opening frames, Thomas Ellison stood tall, polished in posture but smug in tone, addressing Mira O'Neill across the teller counter. His voice wasn't recorded, but the body language told its own story: condescending hand gestures, a slight roll of the eyes, a practiced smirk. Mira remained still, composed, her chin high, her face unreadable. Then the clip cut to another moment. The security guard stepping forward, the shift in posture, the weight in the air. And then Shaq. The final seconds of the video captured him stepping onto the teller floor, stopping just a few feet behind Minera, his voice low but perfectly audible. You denied the financial rights of the woman who signs your payroll. The video ended with silence. But the internet filled that silence with fury. By 9:12 a.m., national outlets had picked it up. By 10 Ausern, Mayor O'Neill trended in 5 cities. By noon, Dominion First Bank issued its first statement. Short, vague, ineffective. We are aware of the situation and are reviewing protocols. It landed like a damp paper towel over a wildfire. Inside the bank, the mood was a mix of panic and paralysis. Executives huddled behind closed doors, drafting apologies that felt both too late and too cautious. Legal teams parsed language. PR strategists debated whether to center her name or obscure it. Compliance raced to protect data trails. But Mira? She didn't run. She didn't hide. At 1:00 p.m., her assistant emailed a press release to every major outlet. Press conference. 3:00 p.m. O'Neill Financial Center. No logo. No sponsor. Just her name. By 2:45, the plaza in front of Dominion First was a sea of reporters, lenses, and live feeds. The bank's employees lined the second-floor windows, peering down with uncertain eyes. Clients paused outside the revolving doors, torn between fascination and discomfort. No podium had been prepared by the bank. Mara had brought her own. At 2:59, she stepped into view. A simple black pantsuit, no jewelry beyond a watch, no entourage, no security, just presence. The crowd hushed. She walked to the microphone with the same quiet power she carried that morning in the lobby. But this time, the world was watching. She didn't read from a script. She didn't pause for applause. She spoke like a woman who had lived the headline long before it printed. I'm not here to talk about one interaction, she began, voice clear. I'm here to talk about a pattern. Cameras clicked. Phones recorded. Live streams scrolled with real-time fire. I walked into a building I partially own, carrying valid identification, a valid check, and a calm demeanor. What I was met with wasn't policy. It was presumption. Her gaze swept the crowd, pausing not for drama but for truth to land. I was questioned, delayed, escorted, because my presence didn't match the narrative someone had already written in their mind. A narrative that said a black woman in a suit must be explained, contained, and if possible, redirected. She let that hang. Not as an accusation, but as an echo. What that manager didn't know, she continued, is that I wasn't just a customer. I was the one whose signature appears on the documents he files quarterly. I didn't lead with that. I shouldn't have to. Respect should never be conditional. A rustle of agreement moved through the crowd. Quiet but unmistakable. But I'm not here for revenge, she said. I'm here for renewal.
The word hit different.
Renewal, not retribution. She took a breath. I have no interest in tearing down this institution. I want to rebuild it. I want to restructure it from the inside, not just with new policies, but with new perspectives. With training that doesn't just check boxes, but changes culture. She reached into her blazer pocket and held up a folded document. This is the proposal I've submitted to the board. It mandates demographic audits, accountability reviews, and a new hiring framework focused on lived experience. It includes a 3-strike equity clause for every employee in a client-facing role, not because we want to punish, but because we must protect. A reporter called out, "Do you want Thomas Ellison fired?" Miara didn't flinch. I want systems held accountable, not just people. But no one who turns away a client they should be serving deserves to represent an institution that claims inclusion. Another hand raised. Is this a PR move? She looked directly into the lens of the closest camera. If this were PR, I'd be silent. I'd let the bank issue a carefully worded apology and stay behind tinted glass. But I came here because this is personal, and not just for me. For every Black professional who's ever had their competence questioned before their credentials were reviewed. For every woman who's been measured before she's been heard. This isn't a scandal. It's a statement. The line hit hard. Because it wasn't just eloquent. It was lived. Behind her, the tall glass windows reflected the city skyline. But for those watching, the reflection had changed. She wasn't just the daughter of a sports icon. She wasn't just a board member. She was the architect of a new standard. I didn't come here to be the exception, she said, voice softer now. I came to make sure there are no more exceptions. I want to walk into a bank and know that any Black client behind me will be greeted with the same trust as the white client in front of me. Not because we raised our voices, not because we went viral, but because it's right. With that, she stepped back from the mic. She didn't smile. She didn't wave. She simply nodded once, and left. No security cleared the way. No ropes held back the press, yet no one followed. Not because they weren't curious, but because she had already given them everything. Inside the bank, the executives watched in silence. The statement was already being uploaded to the company site. Unedited, the board had voted unanimously to publish her proposal under her name. And Thomas? He had resigned that morning. Not with a fight. Not with a final plea. Just a letter. Short and cold. The footage had done what no compliance protocol ever could. By the evening, every news outlet led with her image. Not Shaq. Not the bank. Her alone, standing at the mic. Mid-sentence. Eyes forward. It wasn't a takedown. It was a blueprint. And across boardrooms, classrooms, and living rooms, people began to ask themselves, not what Mimara had said, but what they would have done had she walked through their door. The climax didn't end with applause. It ended with accountability. Thomas Ellison resigned without ceremony. No public statement. No last-minute defense. Just a single-page letter submitted to HR in the early morning hours. Its language clipped and impersonal. By the time the bank's senior leadership logged on that day, his office was already cleared. Desk empty. Nameplate removed. For most employees, news of his exit came through a one-line email from the corporate communications team. Effective immediately, Thomas Ellison has stepped down from his position as branch manager of Dominion First downtown. No fanfare, no distraction, just an end. But where his silence settled, Mara's presence took root. By the week's close, Dominion First Bank issued a company-wide memo titled Equity Forward, New Standards for a New Era. Unlike the standard corporate templates, this one opened with a message from the board acknowledging institutional failure, recognizing the harm done, and announcing structural change. At the core of that change was Mimara O'Neill. Her consulting firm, Arcline Equity Strategies, was formally contracted to lead the development and implementation of a new training initiative. It wasn't designed to be optional. Every branch manager across the country, regardless of tenure, seniority, or performance, was scheduled to begin Phase 1 within the next 60 days. Not just modules, immersive workshops, scenario-based testing, measured transformation. And they weren't just told what to change. They were told why. Each training began with a video. Not of the lobby confrontation, but of Mimara's press conference. Her words, calm, firm, irrefutable, became the opening note to a symphony of reckoning. Employees watched in silence, some in discomfort, others in recognition, but none walked away unaffected. In the weeks that followed, Dominion's internal culture began to shift. Not dramatically, not overnight, but visibly. Floor supervisors began to ask different questions. Branch meetings included discussions, once considered too sensitive. A new reporting tool allowed tellers to flag discretionary incidents, anonymously, safely. Equity liaisons were appointed within every region, not as tokens, but as empowered partners in decision-making. It wasn't fear driving the change. It was clarity. The leadership team, once defensive, grew collaborative. Not every conversation was smooth. Not every policy passed without friction. But something rare was happening. Change wasn't being managed. It was being led. And Mira Bidden fled the media circuit. She declined most interviews, avoided panel appearances, and turned down requests for tell-all exclusives. Her presence remained precise, intentional. She understood what many didn't. Her silence held more power now than a dozen microphones. Instead of speaking more, she built more. Her firm expanded. Arklan opened new offices in Chicago and Atlanta, hired teams from diverse sectors, education, finance, public health, not to monetize the moment, but to scale the model. What began with a single confrontation had become a movement of frameworks and accountability. Institutions began calling, universities, hospitals, tech companies, all asking the same thing: can you help us see what we've ignored? Behind her, steady as ever, stood Shaquille O'Neal. He didn't give interviews either. He didn't posture for headlines. He remained where he had always been, in the background, present but never intrusive. When asked about Mioa during a rare podcast appearance, he simply said, "She's always been the strongest one in the room. She just waited for the right room." That quote traveled just as fast as the video once had. Clients began referencing Mira's name during account consultations, nodding toward the policy guidebook with a smile. Employees, especially women, especially black women, stood a little straighter behind their counters. They knew her story wasn't just survival. It was strategy. And so the room that once closed its doors to her now carried her signature on its walls. She had not raised her voice. She had not demanded allegiance. She had instead shifted the ground beneath them, gently, but permanently, not with scandal, but with precision. And in doing so, Mimira O'Neill had rewritten what power could look like in a suit-and-tie institution. Not loud, not brash, but quiet, clear, unmistakable. The marble floors still gleamed. The same filtered sunlight poured in through the tall windows. The scent of lavender-infused polish still drifted in the air, subtle but constant. The Dominion First Bank downtown branch hadn't changed in structure. Its layout still familiar. Its walls still clad in cool sophistication. But to those who moved through it now, something felt distinctly different. Not louder, not flashier, just better. On a late Thursday morning, a woman stepped through the revolving door, her daughter trailing beside her. The woman wore business slacks, a rust-colored blouse, and the casual determination of someone who had a full day's worth of errands to check off. Her daughter, no more than 8, carried a canvas tote with a keychain that jingled when she walked. She looked around the lobby with wide eyes, not nervous, just curious. They approached the teller counter, and the interaction was simple. No second glances, no delay. The teller, a young man with a calm smile, processed the check swiftly, offering a kind "Take care, Miss Green," before she'd even asked a follow-up question. He didn't ask for extra verification. He didn't look over her shoulder for a supervisor. He just did his job, the way it should have always been done. The little girl, still holding the tote, tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mom," she whispered, "what's that room called?" Her mother turned slightly and followed her daughter's gaze. Across the lobby, behind a pair of glass-paneled doors trimmed in dark brass, hung a new plaque. Its lettering was elegant, carved in matte gold against a deep ebony base. Mimara O'Neill, Executive Boardroom, where every voice counts. The mother smiled. Not wide, not performative, just deep. "That's where decisions are made," she said. "Big ones." The girl tilted her head. "Can kids go in?" "Maybe one day," her mother replied, "if they grow up and help build something better." The girl thought for a moment, then nodded, her eyes fixed on the door. Not in awe, but in possibility. A few feet away, a security guard watched the scene, a knowing look on his face. He'd been here before the shift, had seen the uncomfortable stares, the drawn-out hesitations, the micro decisions masked as policy. Now he stood with ease. He'd seen the other side, and the weight that once settled in this space had lifted, not replaced by noise, but by clarity. Above, the lobby's recessed lights hummed gently. The air conditioning cycled in quiet efficiency. People moved in and out, professionals in suits, parents in sneakers, retirees with checkbooks and routine. But none paused in hesitation. No one looked over their shoulder, waiting to be challenged. And that was the change. Not that a revolution had marched through these floors, but that it had been whispered into them firmly, truthfully, and left behind something durable. On the second floor, behind the now glass-etched conference doors, Mira's imprint remained. Not in decor, not in framed headlines, but in policy binders on executive desks, in the quarterly reports that now included equity impact metrics, in hiring forms revised to include inclusive decision rubrics, in weekly department huddles where every voice, regardless of level, could bring an idea to the table. Her voice no longer echoed in this building. It lived in it. The little girl stared at the plaque a second longer. She's the one in the video, right? That lady who didn't yell but made them listen? Her mother nodded. That's her. She looks like you. She looks like you too. They turned and exited through the same glass doors. The automatic breeze followed them out, and the hum of the city swallowed the space again. But the room they left behind held its silence, not heavy anymore, not guarded, just full. Full of names it would learn to remember. Full of voices it would never again ignore. Because the building didn't forget what had walked in weeks ago. Not a protest.
Not a storm.
Just a woman, armed with truth, and the quiet conviction to change everything she touched. Power doesn't always walk in shouting. Sometimes it waits, measured, watching, building. If this story moved you, sit with it. Share it. Ask yourself what silence you've mistaken for consent. We're not here to go viral. We're here to make systems listen.
Stay curious.
Stay accountable. The next story might start in your lobby.